Before European colonization transformed North America forever, indigenous nations had developed intricate systems of diplomacy that many people today know nothing about. At the heart of these systems was wampum, cylindrical beads crafted from shells that served as much more than mere decoration or currency. In this video, we'll explore the profound significance of wampum among the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and Algonquian peoples, revealing a sophisticated communication system that encoded treaties, preserved history, and facilitated diplomacy across vast networks of indigenous nations. This is the story of a misunderstood technology that colonial powers reduced to money, but which represented one of history's most advanced diplomatic innovations. Wampum beads were meticulously crafted from white and purple shells found along the Atlantic coast. The primary materials came from the quahog clam, which provided the precious purple beads, and the whelk snail, which yielded white beads. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, along with coastal Algonquian peoples including the Narragansett, Pequot, and Wampanoag, were the master craftspeople behind these remarkable objects. The term wampum itself comes from the Narragansett word wampumpeeg, meaning white strings of shell beads. The manufacturing process was extraordinarily labor-intensive, requiring specialized skill and patience. Craftspeople would carefully break shells into small pieces using stone tools. They would then drill holes through these fragments using bow drills with quartz drill bits, a remarkable feat of precision given the technology available. Finally, each bead would be polished against sandstone to create uniform, smooth cylinders that could be strung together. A single standard-sized wampum belt might contain thousands of these beads, representing hundreds of hours of specialized labor. This wasn't mass production. It was sacred craftsmanship that connected the maker to materials that held deep cultural significance. Wampum beads were far more than decorative objects. They formed a sophisticated visual language that could convey complex meanings across different nations and languages. The color dichotomy was fundamental to this system. White beads, crafted from whelk shells, represented concepts of peace, harmony, and good intentions. They symbolized clarity of mind and positive relationships between peoples. Purple beads, made from the darker portions of quahog shells, carried more solemn meanings. They represented war, mourning, or particularly significant diplomatic agreements that required the utmost seriousness. When arranged in specific patterns, these two colors could create a remarkably nuanced binary code that transcended linguistic barriers. The geographic distribution of shell resources naturally created trade networks throughout the Northeast. Inland nations needed to establish relationships with coastal peoples to acquire these precious materials, fostering complex economic and diplomatic interconnections that spanned hundreds of miles. This necessity helped create a shared diplomatic medium among diverse nations with different languages and cultural practices, allowing communication across what might otherwise have been insurmountable cultural divides. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of wampum was its role as both a mnemonic device and a legal document. Wampum belts weren't merely symbolic representations. They were considered legally binding documents, equivalent to modern treaties or constitutions. The beads were woven into specific patterns, geometric designs, stylized figures, or pictographic elements that encoded complex diplomatic agreements, historical events, and sacred knowledge. One of the most famous examples is the Hiawatha Belt, which represents the formation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Its pattern shows 4 white squares connected to a central tree symbol, representing the original 5 nations, the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, united under the Great Law of Peace. When nations gathered for diplomatic discussions, these belts were ceremonially exchanged and their meanings precisely recited by specialized knowledge holders known as wampum keepers. Unlike written documents that remain fixed, wampum belts were considered living entities. Their meanings could be reinterpreted through consensus, allowing indigenous legal frameworks to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining continuity with established traditions. This dynamic quality made wampum an extraordinarily sophisticated political technology that combined physical records with oral tradition in a way that Western documentation systems couldn't match. The ceremonial aspects of wampum exchange were equally crucial to the physical belts themselves. When nations gathered to conduct diplomacy, elaborate protocols governed how wampum was presented, who could speak while holding specific belts, and how agreements were sealed through their exchange. The Condolence Council, a ceremony central to Haudenosaunee diplomatic tradition, used specific wampum strings to symbolically wipe away tears and clear the throat of grieving nations. These rituals created the emotional and spiritual clarity necessary for productive negotiations. This integration of material culture with diplomatic protocol created a system where agreements were simultaneously recorded physically in the belt patterns, orally through memorized recitations, and emotionally through shared ceremonial experience. This multi-layered approach to recording agreements proved remarkably durable, allowing treaties and alliances to persist across generations despite the absence of written language. The ceremonial use of wampum created a diplomatic environment where agreements weren't just intellectual exercises but deeply felt commitments embedded in shared experience, making them far more binding than simply signing a document. When European colonizers encountered wampum, they fundamentally misunderstood its cultural significance. Seeing the high value that indigenous peoples placed on these beads, colonists began manufacturing and using wampum as a form of currency. By 1637, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had declared wampum legal tender, establishing fixed exchange rates against English currency. Dutch and English colonists established wampum factories, mass-producing beads that lacked the sacred and diplomatic significance of traditionally crafted wampum. This colonial appropriation had devastating consequences. The flood of mass-produced wampum disrupted indigenous economies while simultaneously devaluing a sacred diplomatic medium. By the late 17th century, colonial governments began phasing out wampum as legal tender as more European coins became available in the colonies. However, the damage to indigenous diplomatic systems had already been done. Perhaps most tragically, colonists frequently demanded wampum belts as war reparations or forced indigenous leaders to surrender diplomatic belts that recorded land boundaries and treaty rights. Many irreplaceable belts ended up in museum collections or private hands, separated from the knowledge keepers who could interpret their meanings. The colonial monetization of wampum represents one of history's most profound instances of cultural misappropriation. Europeans reduced a sophisticated diplomatic and historical recording system to mere currency, stripping it of its ceremonial context and sacred significance. The transformation of wampum from diplomatic medium to colonial currency paralleled broader colonial patterns of reducing complex indigenous knowledge systems to commodities that could be exploited within European economic frameworks. Colonial records reveal the extent of this misunderstanding. In 1664, when Dutch New Netherland became English New York, the colonial administration valued the colony's treasury at 5,000 guilders of wampum, essentially valuing diplomatic and sacred objects purely for their material worth. This fundamental misconception persisted in academic understanding until relatively recently, with many 20th-century historians continuing to describe wampum primarily as primitive money rather than as sophisticated political technology. The colonial reduction of wampum to currency exemplifies how European powers systematically misinterpreted indigenous technologies through their own cultural lens, unable or unwilling to recognize the complex systems of knowledge that indigenous nations had developed. This misunderstanding wasn't merely academic. It facilitated the dismantling of indigenous diplomatic networks that had maintained peace and facilitated trade across vast regions for centuries before European arrival. Beyond its diplomatic and economic functions, wampum held profound spiritual significance for many indigenous nations. The shells themselves were believed to embody living energy, connecting users to both ancestral wisdom and the natural world. The circular holes drilled through each bead were said to represent pathways through which thoughts and intentions could flow, making wampum not just a recording medium but a conduit for spiritual communication. For the Haudenosaunee, certain wampum belts were considered sacred objects with their own spiritual agency. The Confederacy belt, which records the founding of their political alliance, is treated not as a historical artifact but as a living entity that continues to bind the Six Nations together. Similarly, condolence strings used in mourning ceremonies were understood to absorb grief and transform it, helping communities process collective trauma. This spiritual dimension helps explain why the colonial seizure of wampum belts was so devastating. From an indigenous perspective, these weren't simply historical records being taken but living entities being held captive, severed from their communities and ceremonial contexts. The spiritual power of wampum also explains why many indigenous communities are hesitant to have historic belts displayed in museum settings, where they are treated as static objects rather than as beings deserving of proper ceremonial care. In recent decades, indigenous nations have undertaken significant efforts to reclaim wampum belts from museums and revitalize traditional wampum practices. The Onondaga Nation successfully secured the return of several significant wampum belts from the New York State Museum in 1989 after a lengthy legal battle. This was a landmark moment in the broader movement for cultural repatriation of indigenous sacred items. Contemporary indigenous artisans are reviving traditional wampum crafting techniques, though now using modern tools alongside conventional methods. Beyond the physical reclamation of historic belts, this cultural resurgence represents a deeper reassertion of indigenous diplomatic traditions and governance systems. Modern wampum creation connects contemporary indigenous communities with ancestral knowledge systems that colonial powers attempted to eradicate. The Wampum Trail Project, a collaborative research initiative between indigenous knowledge keepers and academic institutions, has worked to document historic wampum belts scattered across museums worldwide. This project aims not just to locate physical artifacts but to reconnect them with the oral traditions and ceremonial knowledge necessary for their proper interpretation. These efforts represent a profound act of cultural healing, reconnecting communities with material heritage that embodies their political and spiritual traditions. The story of wampum illustrates how indigenous nations developed sophisticated systems for recording history, conducting diplomacy, and managing complex political relationships, systems that operated successfully for centuries before European contact. Rather than primitive curiosities, wampum belts represent evidence of advanced political technologies developed by indigenous North Americans, technologies whose full complexity scholars are only beginning to appreciate. Wampum embodied a remarkable integration of material culture, oral tradition, ceremonial practice, and diplomatic protocol that created durable records of agreements across vast distances and diverse languages. The binary visual language of white and purple beads, arranged in meaningful patterns, could encode complex concepts that transcended linguistic barriers. The ceremonial exchange of these belts created shared experiences that reinforced the emotional and spiritual commitments underlying diplomatic agreements. As contemporary indigenous nations continue to assert sovereignty and revitalize traditional governance systems, wampum is once again emerging as a powerful symbol of indigenous diplomatic traditions that predate European concepts of international relations. Its ongoing significance reminds us that North America's political history didn't begin with European colonization but builds upon thousands of years of sophisticated indigenous governance systems that deserve recognition in our understanding of political development. Today, wampum continues to play a vital role in the cultural and political life of many indigenous nations. When the Haudenosaunee gather for significant council meetings, historic wampum belts are still brought forth to guide discussions and remind leaders of ancient agreements and principles. Contemporary indigenous diplomats are incorporating traditional wampum protocols into modern negotiations with state and federal governments, asserting the continuity of indigenous political systems that predate colonial institutions. In educational settings, wampum is being used to teach young indigenous people about their governance traditions and diplomatic heritage. New wampum belts are being created to commemorate contemporary events and agreements, continuing the living tradition of recording history through this medium. The story of wampum challenges us to reconsider conventional narratives about political development in North America. It reveals that long before Europeans arrived with their written treaties and constitutions, indigenous nations had developed sophisticated systems for recording agreements, preserving history, and conducting international relations. These systems weren't primitive precursors to European diplomacy but represented alternative and equally valid approaches to solving the universal challenges of governance and internation relationships. By understanding wampum as advanced political technology rather than primitive currency or mere decoration, we gain a more accurate and respectful understanding of indigenous contributions to political thought and practice. Wampum represents one of North America's most sophisticated indigenous technologies, a system that seamlessly integrated material craft, oral tradition, diplomatic protocol, and spiritual practice. For centuries before European arrival, these meticulously crafted shell beads facilitated complex diplomatic relationships across vast territories and diverse cultures. The colonial reduction of wampum to mere currency exemplifies a broader pattern of European powers failing to recognize the depth and complexity of indigenous knowledge systems. As we've seen, wampum was far more than money or decoration. It was a living record of agreements, a spiritual conduit, and the physical embodiment of nation-to-nation relationships. The ongoing efforts of indigenous communities to reclaim historic belts and revitalize wampum traditions speak to the enduring power of this technology. The story of wampum challenges us to recognize that North America's political history didn't begin with European colonization but builds upon thousands of years of sophisticated indigenous governance systems. By understanding wampum as the advanced political innovation it truly was, we gain a more complete picture of human ingenuity and the diverse ways societies have developed systems to record history, establish diplomacy, and build lasting peace across cultural boundaries. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for updates. Your feedback is appreciated. We hope to see you again.